This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and film critic, and today I'm going to be talking to Adrian Martin, who is an amazing Australian critic who's written several books, including the BFI classics Once Upon a Time in America, which was one of the first books I ever dipped into in that series, that brilliant series of sort of pocket-sized guides and in-depth dives. We talk about that. We talk also about Terrence Malick, who's been a mutual research interest to both of us. Remember, if you like the episode, please subscribe, leave a review if you can, and share it far and wide amongst your friends. You can follow me on Twitter at Dr. Jonty, DRJONTY. But before you do any of that, please enjoy the conversation.
I began really as a really obsessive enthusiast in my teenage years, and quite early in my teenage years. So already at the age of say 14, I was writing a lot. I was filling notebooks, which I still have, with kind of as it were almost pretend reviews or imitation reviews. I call them imitation reviews because at that time I was already reading a lot. I was going to the local library and reading Sight and Sound magazine, Film Comment. I could also buy them very easily just at the local newspaper and magazine shop. Those were the days, where you could buy Film Comment for a few dollars, around the corner. And so I was sort of doing these sort of imitations of, Richard Coombs in Sight and Sound or Raymond Derniet in Film Comment. I was kind of doing these imitation film crits, and meanwhile watching a lot of films on television, going to a lot of films, and it was very easy then, and this is the mid-70s we're talking about. It was very easy then to see an enormously broad range of films. This is in Melbourne, Australia, and art films, old Hollywood classics, all kinds of stuff. The Robert Altman films, all those American films of the 70s were getting commercial releases then, as well as Luis Buñuel movies and all sorts of stuff. It was on cinema screens, And so I was doing all of these kind of, imitation reviews. And then around the age of 15, 16, I started sending out reviews to magazines, to magazine editors, because it was almost like a teenage dream. I wanted to be a film critic. I wanted to be a film reviewer, film critic. And so, and of course I got a bunch of rejection letters, which I also still have. And I keep everything. But then at the age of 19, I started to be published, So I'd had a whole lot of years of practice of writing and sort of moving towards finding my own style as a writer originally by sort of imitating others, and then finding my own style, my own voice. And so, at the age of 19, my first review of a film book, not of a film, appeared in the Australian magazine Cinema Papers, which was very popular for a number of decades, that magazine. And so, that's how, and once I was kind of in there, I just sort of wrote obsessively, and all kinds of things, film reviews, book reviews, but also longer articles. I was, attempting to write, and a fair number of these got published. And very early on, I sort of involved myself with what's called in Australia and elsewhere the small magazine scene. So arts magazines, sort of culture magazines as they were called at the time. And these were magazines were mixtures of sort of politics, culture across the arts, lifestyle, fashion. So all these things were kind of mixed up in these 80s magazines. We were into the 80s now. And I wrote very prolifically for for a whole bunch of these magazines. And I was also involved with, sometimes co-editing these kinds of magazines. And so I was getting kind of published everywhere, partly because I was sort of pushing myself, and also partly because, by the age of 22, I was a kind of a well-known figure in a small world, in the small world of Melbourne publishing. I was a go-to person for film articles, and I already had a lot of, as it were, esoteric knowledge about world cinema, about all kinds of things, as well as film criticism and film theory, which had gone through a big burgeoning period in the late 70s. And so I was this sort of freelance guy. I didn't last very long at university. I dropped out of university before the second year got very far. But I knew a lot of people in the university scene, so I was writing some, quasi-academic pieces as well as writing film reviews, writing for the local newspaper in my suburb. So I was kind of doing all these different kinds of activity, quite a lot, sort of prolifically and obsessively. So that was really my grounding as a writer, was to do a lot of it and to do it in many different styles. And then much further down the track, mid-90s, by that time, I got, a few good offers. One to be a weekly film reviewer at a major newspaper in Australia, which was called The Age, still is called The Age, and also to be on national radio, Australian radio, a channel called Radio National, in which I did a 15-minute scripted film review every week for 3 years. And so in that radio slot, I churned out, around 350, long scripts, which eventually became the basis for my website. That's sort of all this unpublished stuff that I had from the mid-90s. I thought, oh, well, it's time to get this out there as some kind of a chronicle of that time in cinema. And that was what, upon my newspaper reviews and my radio reviews, were the sort of the original pool of my website, which of course I've added many other things to ever since.
To just rewind even further back, when does sort of cinema become this important thing? Because it seems also like something I really relate to is this sort of compulsion not to just see films, but to put down your thoughts and to address, and to read other people about them. I've always been in the middle, as you can tell from this podcast's, whole idea. The nexus between thinking, writing, and films is very important to me. So when did that occur?
Once again, that occurred very early, and it was a sort of a natural thing for me because even when I was a small child, I was sort of fascinated by the fantasy of being a writer and writing. And of course, when I was 10 years old, that probably expressed itself more as that I wanted to write science fiction. I had dreams of being that kind of writer, a fiction writer, which never happened. And then that sort of passion of reading and writing, reading novels and short stories and so on, and this sort of compulsion to write, that eventually shunted itself into criticism, into critical writing, which I found I had a great facility for, and partly through the schooling I had as a kid, I had a good facility for English literature, analysis and that kind of thing. Emily Dickinson, all this kind of stuff. I loved writing, essays about that when I was a school kid. And then the reading of critical literature. Once again, you remember, these are the days, I'm speaking about the 70s, where books like Victor Perkins' Film as Film, even, books like Manny Farber's Negative Space, these were like popular paperbacks. Like, you could get these books anywhere. You could get them in any bookshop. You could get them in libraries, local libraries. And your friends would pass them to you. My elder brothers, had these books and so on. So it was a sort of a very natural thing for me. And I really enjoyed reading criticisms of figures like Robin Wood and people like this. Their work was very accessible on all levels, physically accessible. And I found it, intellectually very exciting and accessible and so on. So I was reading all this stuff quite voraciously as a teenager. And then as soon as I realised that I could basically just wander into any university library and pick up the things from the shelves and start reading them, that's when I started reading more like film theory and so on. But I had the amusing experience of at the age of 17, kind of landing at tertiary education, university level education, or teachers' college in my case. I landed there on the first day, and I was shocked that all of my fellow students had not read Raymond Durniat, Robin Wood, Victor Perkins, Pauline Kael, Manny Farber. I'd already read all this stuff. And I'm talking to my new comrades, and they think I'm nuts. They really think I'm mad. And even the teacher is giving me a kind of a sideways look, like, where did this kid come from? And that is why, when I dropped out, when I became a university dropout, I was immediately hired as a teacher. And so at the age of 19, I was teaching at university level.
Those who can't be teachers, those who can't be students teach, I guess.
Yes, fantastic. And, very 70s. Like this could never happen today, that, a dropout is immediately hired to be a teacher. But in those days, it was still the era of, radical pedagogy. And basically the philosophy is that if you know something, come in and teach it, come in and impart your knowledge, your passion. And so, there were, in the place where I was teaching, there were a lot of filmmakers teaching, video makers, artists, they were all breezing in and out. And very few of them had university degrees. And I didn't have a university degree. I only got a degree much, much later, close to the age of 50. And so it was a curious and very accelerated path that I was on. And so by the age of, 18, 19, I was really very soaked in all of this more theoretical thinking about film. I was reading Screen magazine and all this kind of, heavy stuff, Raymond Balleur and all this kind of thing. Laura Mulvey, all of that. This was all sort of second nature to me. And then my struggle was sort of trying to bring all these diverse things together, the sort of the more writerly, stylistic, writing of somebody like Raymond Durniat with the hard theory of the 1970s, and that's, in a way, that's been my quest ever since.
A bit of Tabasco from Pauline Kael.
Yeah.
To spice things up. So who were your sort of go-to filmmakers then that you were, you were sort of thinking, I mean, it's not necessarily the same question as sort of like who inspired you or you loved, but you found sort of particular you wanted to discuss, you wanted to talk about.
So at that time in my basically late teenage, early 20s, I was, on the one hand, I had an enormous love of the classical American cinema and also then contemporary American cinema. So that figures like Frank Tashlin, that was like a major thing. One of my first essays that I wrote, important sort of long essays, was an essay on Frank Tashlin, his comedies with Jerry Lewis. Jerry Lewis himself, as a filmmaker, was incredibly important to me because it was one of those experiences where I had watched as a teenager his film The Ladies' Man on television, and it kind of blew my head off because I suddenly saw the camera work. I saw the colour in the set design. I saw the gestures of the actors, particularly Jerry Lewis himself, of course. And I just had this vision of, what is a film and, what is cinema and how a film is put together.
You sort of see it as an artifact almost.
Yeah, because in say, Jerry Lewis and Frank Tashlin, all of that is very evident. It's all very foregrounded. There's a lot of jokes about the filmmaking process. The camera moves back and you see the whole set, as an artificial construction in The Ladies' Man. So all of this was kind of a revelation to me. So on the one hand, there was things like Hollywood comedy, musicals. I loved all of this very artificial kind of forms of the 1950s cinema. I very quickly learned to love the sort of classic Hollywood comedies. Howard Hawks, His Good Friday, Preston Sturges's films were incredibly important to me then. And then sort of to leap across to another area of cinema, sort of very early on through me sort of being involved with the university culture and film clubs and everything, I got into the French New Wave, Godard particularly, but also, Chantal Akerman, which a lot of her films were screening in all sorts of, alternative venues at that time in Australia. Fassbinder, Buñuel was very important and, in fact, quite a sort of popular filmmaker at that time, at the end of his career when he made those great final films in the 1970s. That was some of the spans. It was basically classic cinema, mainly American at that time for me, sort of world art cinema, and then the more marginal fringes of it, like Ackerman, like Michael Snow, Hollis Frampton, all of these kinds of figures. As I became very, very interested, sort of compellingly interested in the avant-garde and experimental film, which in a way is the flip side of the watching Jerry Lewis, because in the experimental films everything was exposed. All of the techniques, all of the construction was on the surface, and often with a different kind of politics, and so all of that was incredibly appealing to me as a young cinephile.
Yeah, it's so interesting how comedy often does effortlessly what more serious art cinema, makes a huge hoo-ha about and does much more, say, mechanically. I'm just thinking of how Buster Keaton manages to deconstruct the entirety of cinema in Sherlock Jr. in 5 minutes, and in a way that, experimental films would in their dreams get to that, that brilliance and that imagination. I don't want to knock experimental cinema as such. It's just the facility of comedy sometimes to do stuff so much better, and yet not be appreciated as well.
Absolutely. And a figure exactly like Buster Keaton as a filmmaker and as a performer, like so important to a burgeoning cinephile understanding, to watch any of those great Buster Keaton films, is to, suddenly have this vision of film form, of space, time, of bodies in space and all this kind of stuff. I mean, what he did with all that was so brilliant, and, as you're saying, seemingly so effortless and, unself-conscious at a certain, intellectual or theoretical level, but, absolutely brilliant on all levels.
I mean, I'm ashamed to say Buster Keaton's not necessarily a recent discovery, but only from the last sort of 5 or 6 years that I've really, I was always more a Charlie Chaplin. Well, as a kid, it would always be Laurel and Hardy that was on first thing in the morning on TV. You'd have Harold Lloyd and Laurel and Hardy. So, just another quick question that intrigues me. Who was your science fiction guy? Who was the person who you were reading?
Well, in science fiction, it was an enormous. I read hundreds and hundreds of science fiction novels when I was into science fiction as a young kid. And so on the one hand, there were the classics, Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, Robert Heinlein, all that sort of stuff. Then I got into what seemed to be more unusual forms of it, which was Philip K. Dick, J.G. Ballard, and particularly a guy, I'm interested to know whether you're familiar with his work, R.A. Lafferty. Have you ever read any of R.A. Lafferty's work? He does these sort of wildly speculative, weird sort of Americana, what later became steampunk. He was many decades before this, with this crazy verbal facility, mixturing languages, invented languages and stuff, and wild humour. Yeah. And I was absolutely in love with Lafferty's work as a young sci-fi reader. And his work is scarcely science fiction, it always has a level of fantasy and imagination, but it wasn't at all space opera stuff. And that, to this day, I can enjoy reading R.A. Lafferty. That's something I really do enjoy revisiting. And the grounding in Philip Dick and J.G. Ballard, of course, served me well, in later years when I'm looking at, Cronenberg's films and other stuff like that.
I had my youth steeped in science fiction and sort of slowly graduated through to horror, and then from horror to sort of the real world. But I'm kind of going back to science fiction. I'm going back to people like Ursula K. Le Guin.
Le Guin, yeah. yeah. That was another very important influence for me was Ursula Le Guin, and also in the science fiction scene, like the social scene in Australia. Like in many countries, there were like these science fiction conventions. Where all kinds of intriguing nerd people would show up. Including me, and but we're hearing what I now realised, or later realised, were very intellectual talks, about Philip K. Dick, about the, cosmological views and all kinds of stuff. And there was a lot of discussion of Ursula Le Guin and her importance as a woman in science fiction and her view of otherness, and all this kind of thing. And all of this was sort of going into my head at the age of 13. And indeed, there were a couple of famous film people who would speak at science fiction conferences, such as a very famous Australian film critic named John Flaus, who's been inspiration for many generations of film critics in Australia. And when I was 13, I heard John, who later became a friend of mine. I heard John give a visionary talk about comparing classic English poetry to science fiction visions, and then on to Stanislav Lem, Solaris, 2001: Space Odyssey, all of that, So that's the kind of thing I was exposed to as a young nerd at a science fiction convention. A little bit different, maybe, to the Star Wars type conventions of today. I'm not sure.
I don't know. I just feel science fiction is a great grounding in stretching the possibilities, and then. Sure. There are corners of it which are very dull, or you realize later on, oh, hang on a minute, they're not landing on different planets, they're just landing on different weather, and it's not, there is sort of, how do you imagine what hasn't been imagined before, and what doesn't exist in the world.
Exactly.
So yeah, it's a really interesting. I don't know. I'm glad I got over my initial sort of, that thing where you sort of kill your darlings and you say, I'm not going to read any more of that trash. That's for kids, and then hopefully you mature and you return to it and say, okay, actually there was something in this I saw as a kid and there's something in it I see now. So moving on to, I want to talk a little bit about the BFI Classics book, where I first read your work, and I've since read your work in Sight and Sound and other places, which was for Once Upon a Time in America, which is, I'm a huge Sergio Leone fan. I live in Italy. I've lived in Italy now for 25 years, so I'm really love my Leone. Once Upon a Time in America was always the problem film for me, in that I loved it. It had loads of great things in it, but there was just something that bothered me. And I think reading your book, you sort of crystallized that in a way. And I don't want to say allowed me to like it, but it did that thing that great criticism does, which is it introduces complexity without diminishing it, or without, you know what I mean, without sort of simplifying it in a way that seems at the moment on Twitter and places like that to be sort of the go-to position, which is just like, okay, it's this or it's this. What was your first experience of Leone, and how did you come about writing that book?
My first experience of Leone, in fact, was once again in childhood, because even though I don't really come from a family of cinephiles, but my dad was, and still is at the age of 100, a huge Westerns fan. So as a little kid, every Saturday, this was still possible in the 60s, he would take me to a Western on a big screen every weekend. And so, I was seeing, Howard Hawks' El Dorado and all this kind of stuff as a little kid. And I was seeing the Italian Westerns. I was seeing the Sergio Leone films with Clint Eastwood, even though I had no idea what the name Sergio Leone was at that time. And, right through to something like Dakusaka, Jules La Testa, early 70s. All of these on these absolutely enormous and loud screens in the big movie palaces of Melbourne. And so that had given me a kind of a sensory feeling. And then eventually, of course, I started reading and I knew who Sergio Leone was then. So I always had sort of Sergio Leone in my DNA, as a cinephile, that's for sure. And when it came around to that book, years later, I was contacted at the very start of the British Film Institute's classics series, classics and modern classics, and basically I was asked by Ed Buscombe, who was the original series editor. I got this because this was the days of fax machines, right? So I got this fax one morning simply saying, write me a list of what you consider to be 5 modern classics of cinema. That's all. There was no talk of writing a book or anything. It was just give me a list of 5 modern classics. And I remember I put on that list Robert Bresson's L'Argent, Money. I put Monty Hellman's Tulane Blacktop. I put Chantal Ackerman's Jeanne Dielman.
A popular choice now.
Yes, indeed. I was ahead of my time on that one. And Once Upon a Time in America was like number 4 or 5 on this hierarchical list. And then I got another fax back saying, okay, you can write a book on number 4, which was Once Upon a Time in America. And it was explained to me that some of the other filmmakers I had chosen were probably wouldn't sell too many books, but Sergio Leone would, and Robert De Niro would, and this was a kind of a popular choice because it was a relatively popular film, I think, in the UK at that time, and of course around the world. Now, of course, I had seen the film a whole number of times by then, and I remember my very first screening was an absolutely devastating experience. To see that film, I was 24, 25 years old, and I thought it was a film that left me, in the best sense, with a totally wretched feeling. Like I felt awful at the end of it, and I was in tears, and like a real anguish comes through in that film, and it's an anguish to do with masculinity, and an anguish to do with male behaviour. And somehow Leone kind of found the best vehicle for himself was through the gangster genre. And so stories of violence, of glamour, and so on, which led him, by steps into this very, very agonised story of male sexuality and it's sort of male oblivion in a sense, because Once Upon a Time in America is sort of the story of a person who completely loses their life, but then, as it were, lives as a ghost, until they return to their past. Now, I found all this unbelievably poetically powerful. And then to start studying the film, to study its famous rearranged chronology and so on, and to look at all of the patterns, the motifs and so on in the film, just like endlessly fascinating to me. And then to do some research, and I actually had a brief correspondence with one of the people who worked on the screenplay, which was Stuart Kaminsky, who was also a film critic and a film teacher in America. I have a beautiful kind of letter of about 4 pages, beautifully typed from Stuart Kaminsky, in which he says, he got a kind of a relatively minor credit. I think he was given a credit for American dialogue or something like that, And in fact, he wrote all of the dialogue of the film, and he wrote the dialogue in collaboration with Robert De Niro. He wrote De Niro's dialogue in collaboration with De Niro. And at the end of his letter, Stuart says, it's the proudest professional experience of my life to have worked on that film. It really was incredibly a meaningful thing to him. It wasn't just a job of work where he spent a few days cranking out a few pages of dialogue. It was a very, very important thing for him. And so I got further insight into sort of the intensity of that film and the intensity of it for everyone, or many people who worked on it, and for Leone himself, of course, who obviously invested an enormous kind of amount of his own sort of contradictory personality, because on the one hand, Leone, very gregarious guy, very Italian guy in many ways, but then there's this other side of him that's obviously very, very anguished, very agonized, very guilt-ridden, and all of that is in the film. As you're saying, in the age of Twitter, people kind of dismiss this film as problematic, problematic film. Of course, it's a problematic film. Many good films are problematic because they're dealing with intense contradictions and the living of living out of intense contradictions, the contradiction between what you feel inside and what the society or the social world kind of makes you behave as, and for me, all of that is there in Once Upon a Time in America.
Absolutely. I mean, I was reading something recently about how there is a sort of a hormone that's released by the brain that when we see it, it's like when we see cute kittens or cute babies, there's a bit of us that want to crush them, because it's basically, it's kind of like an evolutionary thing that you're supposed to love beautiful, cute things. And so you've got that affection and that love for these beautiful, cute things. But on the evolutionary timescale, if you love it too much, you won't run away fast enough when you have to save yourself from the tiger. So you've also got to have a counterbalancing sort of urge to destruction. And so those contradictions are inside the human condition. They're inescapable. And misogyny, and the film has misogyny in it, is about misogyny and is misogynistic. I think there is an element of inescapable misogyny that you can't. But misogyny is also built on a kind of inside a contradiction, which also idealizes and romanticizes women. I feel so that, and that was that's definitely what that film comes down to in terms of my discomfort. Are those two rape scenes, which is played sort of as a comedy rape, and the other which is played as a tragedy rape. One thing that surprises me about that film, and I think you were elemental in pointing it out to me, was how the violence is treated so much differently to how it's treated in the Westerns, where in the Westerns the violence is this grand operatic set piece, but I think there's a shooting that begins really early on in the film where I think it's in like a factory or some sort of industrial setting, and you make the point, okay, in one of the Westerns this would have been a whole thing, but here it's kind of almost like you can't see what's going on, and it's Also, the idea that this was his final film seems very, it's kind of fitting. It's tragic that it is his final film. I would have loved to have seen, what was his next film going to be? Leningrad.
Yeah, Leningrad. Yeah. That was, I mean, he did a fair bit of, I think, preparatory work on that. So he certainly didn't mean Once Upon a Time in America to be his last film. I mean, no, very few filmmakers sort of intend their last film to be their last film. And so he was working on another one. But as you say, it's kind of poignantly fitting that this, most tragic and, elegiac and melancholic of films was his final testament. Film critics and cinephiles tend to be a bit obsessed, perhaps sometimes over-obsessed, with this idea of the testament film, the film that sums up the life and the art and so on. When, of course, when you talk to filmmakers themselves, it's like, I got to make that film just because the stars aligned in the right way and the money was there and the script was there and we could start in 2 weeks, and we started, And so it's not like filmmakers, are saying in 10 years, I will make my testament. It's not that kind of thought process when you're actually making films. But nonetheless, we can look at, some of these, what turn out to be final films, and say what a testament it is, and that's very true with Once Upon a Time in America, because it is a film so obsessed with death, with mortality, and when you start to study the film closely, as I did, you see how that's there, literally from the first moments of the film. This the whole series of metaphors, of images, of atmospheres that relate to the question of death and impending death.
Yeah, absolutely. There's just like there's loads of mock death in it as well, isn't there? There's the sort of the coughing for prohibition and the hearse, which they get him out of jail. They greet him on the way out of jail. Yeah, that's such an image. I mean, this is so classically Leone, where it's almost sort of rude, and I think there is a sort of prevailing critical response to Leone, which see him as a crude filmmaker, maybe mixed in with a little bit of sort of racist stereotyping. But that idea that they sort of surprise him with a prostitute in a coffin is just like, wow, wow, Sergio, that is on the nose.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, he wasn't afraid of that. I mean, that was definitely part of Leone's artistic personality. His creative drive was that there definitely is a rude, outrageous, blasphemous, and everything else quality in there. I mean, he was very, very involved with traditions of popular art, popular art forms, everything from, the circus onward. I mean, it's the same with Fellini and a whole number of filmmakers, very, very plugged into the history of popular arts. And Leone certainly was not ashamed of that. He also knew he was an artist, and I feel in Once Upon a Time in America that was the film where he really, really took that on, that this was going to be, in some sense, his artistic testament or his artistic statement. He was really going to make, what we later term an art film. But using, popular genres. And really, I think he did that so wonderfully in that film.
I mean, when I was watching those films as a kid, it's so interesting you're talking about going to the cinema with your dad, and congratulations on the 100. That's amazing.
Yeah.
The Centurion. I think I missed something, certainly, because my experience of Westerns was almost exclusively via television. But the thing that Sergio Leone's Westerns always meant for me was heat. There was just a temperature to them. They were always sweaty, hot films. And then Once Upon a Time in America is a kind of wintry film. It really stands out as a different sort of temperature to the other, for a few dollars more, and Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and of course the long desert scene, which is about as hot as you can get on film. When you so you'd done the BFI book and the other books that you had opportunities to write, what were the was that something, that a job that just rolled on one from the other, or were you in a position to sort of choose your subjects with in a narrower focus, rather than having to give 5 names for five possibilities and go for one?
The various books that I've written have come about in all kinds of different ways, and for many of them, in fact, I was approached with some kind of commission. So, for instance, I've done several books with film festivals. So I did a book on the filmmaker Raoul Ruiz, one of my favourite filmmakers, and I was approached by the Rotterdam Film Festival and the Buenos Aires Film Festival to do a book on him and partly with him, because he contributed texts to them. So that was like a film festival kind of book. Some books I tried to get happening myself, sometimes succeeded and sometimes failed to do that. The BFI came to me again for a project that I know you'll want to talk about a bit more, which is they had started a World Cinema Directors Series. This is around the year 2000. And I was approached to do a book on Terrence Malick for that series, which I researched for a whole number of years, and we'll come back to the story of that. I'm sure you want to talk about it.
Sure,
because Malick's your turf too. And so that was a commission. There was, and there were several commissions that sort of across my life so far that I never entirely fulfilled. That was one of them. And another one was for a book on Brian De Palma, who I think is a very great filmmaker. And at a certain point in my life, I kind of got frustrated with the format of the director study. They're actually very hard to write, because you kind of say a number of general things at the start of the book, and then you do one film at a time. You go through each film of the director, and you're kind of repeating over and over again the same things, or you're pushing the book towards a slightly artificial developmental curve, the director becoming more mature or something. And I found all of these forms finally cracking apart for me. They weren't working for me. It's okay to sit at a table with your friend and go, yes, the latest Brian De Palma film is his most mature film. But when you try to write that, it sounds a bit hollow. It can sound hollow, So at that point, I thought, I don't really want to write director studies. So both of those books kind of fell by the wayside, and I tried to do some other things, books more about ideas around film, or joining a whole lot of different films by different directors. And so the book of my my sort of collected essays, my collected best essays, which is a book called Mysteries of Cinema, which came out in 2018 and in another edition in 2020. I mean, that's a book I'm really proud of because, I get to explore the whole range from the Hollywood comedies and musicals we were talking about right through to the experimental films. My interests in film theory and philosophy and everything else, popular culture, it's all in there, and that's a book that I'm happiest with because it really does represent kind of who I am as a writer and as a critic.
I was reading your review of Tar today, actually, just before we came on the. And I'm also really interested in this idea of people who've been around, who've been on the scene for a long time and have been watching films for a long time, and here we are, there's this sort of element of just having, the older I become, the more I appreciate having that sort of depth of vision, your field of focus is much deeper. And it's something that isn't being represented by the Twitterati. And I don't mean to knock Twitter. I mean, I enjoy Twitter, and it's given me a reach that I would not have otherwise had. But the way that discourse is being managed just seems to be a little bit reductive to my eyes. How do you see it at the moment, the sort of like that state of criticism at the moment?
Well, it's a very confused scene, It's a very confused scene. I mean, I think a lot of the trends that you're pointing to there's the whole Twitter world of the hot takes and the love it, hate it. There are many regressive tendencies in that world and a lack of depth and one of the knock-on effects of that, which really does concern me, is that even when serious good critics right now, they feel they have to respond to that whole world of, so many articles now begin with, I turned on my Twitter and someone said, this film is crap. And then another person said, this film is a masterpiece. And then another person said, so we have to kind of play through the whole Twitter scene to sort of situate us in the current, cultural conversation. And I think sometimes what a bloody waste of time and mental energy this is. This is really diverting us from, look, just go to the film, just get to the film and talk about it. Don't tell me what Twitter said about it. Don't take that as the most important context for the film, this immediate context of opinions. This is a strange, revolution, and not for the best in film criticism. I think is this sense that I mean, I understand it. I've met many film critics who, as they get older, they think, oh, I'm not relevant, I'm not young, I'm not plugged into pop culture, and then it's like, hey, turn on Twitter, then I'll know what the young people are saying, And it's like, oh dear, God, sometimes I'd rather not know what the young people are saying on Twitter. And like you were saying, John, I really value the fact that I've had all of these years of watching film, of reading about film, and of writing about film, and that my own work, my own archive, which is now my website, gives me this kind of this history that I can go into and explore and critique and develop and elaborate. That's important for me, And you mentioned the current film Tar, and it amazes me that people sort of take that film in a transparent way, like it's a film about a music conductor, and yet it's so unrealistic and this and that. When I saw the film, I thought, well, this is a very Scorsese-influenced film. It's the rise and the fall of a person who's high on their own supply, to use the famous phrase from Brian De Palma's Scarface. It's about the crashing down of that person, their hubris and so on. But very few of these, hot take in the cultural conversation pieces make the comparison with Scorsese, which to me is one of the most evident things about the film to discuss in all sorts of ways. And yeah, no, it's astonishing to me sometimes, the sort of lack of history, of any kind of historical overview, whether it's world history or cinema history, that's getting into some forms of contemporary film criticism. And on the other hand, online writing does give you, if you're lucky, some really good chances to explore things, to express yourself. And that's why I got myself involved with, starting magazines online, the magazines Rouge and Lola, and in the very early days, Senses of Cinema. They were things where I wanted to be involved in a magazine that published what I wanted to read, the kind of thing that I wanted to read, which was in-depth, not stuck to the latest release in cinema, not stuck to the contemporary conversation in social media. This is really a thing whenever a new or a young film critic asks for my advice is always start your own thing, start your own magazine, start your own film festival, start your own, whatever it might be, whatever it is you want to do. But the thing that you want to see happen, make it happen, or try to help make it happen. And there are a lot of initiatives like that all around the world. A magazine will appear, perhaps even print magazines. Print magazines are kind of making a bit of a comeback now in the film world. Yeah, and some of them are terrific.
Maybe releasing a sort of hard copy, paper-only magazine, and almost like the vinyl of journalism.
Exactly, the vinyl of journalism and of film criticism. And, for instance, some of my friends in Argentina do a wonderful book called Vida Útil, The Useful Life, which is named after an Uruguayan film about a guy who runs a movie cinema. And, fantastic magazine. And so what I see in that of people launching print magazines is this sort of attempt to kind of take back the critical discourse into the smaller group, not into the mass, online, I got 3 million hits on my hot take, sort of nonsense. That's mania. That is the path to madness when people think about, the number of thousands and millions of hits they're going to get for their tweet and all that thing. Awful. I mean, it doesn't lead to anything good as far as I'm concerned. Whereas the counter reaction is to start a small print magazine, and maybe it'll only be for 100 people, but those 100 people are serious.
Or a podcast.
Or a Substack, So I think there are initiatives that are possible through, of course, current technology and computers and everything that can be really good, but we have to do a bit more effort to sort of point the way to these things, give people the path to discover them, because that's sort of what we lack in contemporary digital culture is pathways. The Google search is not going to lead you to this magazine in Argentina necessarily very quickly. So we need people to sort of stand up and to recommend, to make, really good recommendations of the kind of stuff they could chase.
Absolutely. I totally concur with that. And, I would say as well that the whole, one of the things, again, referencing back to your Thai review, and you mentioned Scorsese, and you also in your review, you mentioned Haneke, and a little bit, there are these names that that not even 20 years ago, 10, 15 years ago, were kind of like on the must-see list, on the list of filmmakers you have to address. And okay, maybe they're not making films, maybe they've even died. Bernardo Bertolucci would be another one for me, the names are sort of slightly just fading out of the conversation. Nobody's talking about them anymore. Bertolucci possibly because of the Last Tango in Paris sort of revelations about how the film was made or how a certain scene was filmed. Serious things. Yeah, I'm not dismissing them at all, but at the same time, these are massive filmmakers the filmmakers that we're watching today who are releasing films right now have a debt to these people. So how much you understand them will be narrowed if we don't sort of continue to have a breadth and depth of movies we're thinking about and people we're thinking about.
I completely agree with you, John, 100%. I mean, the I just want to say something about Bertolucci because I share your passion for Bertolucci, and I even had a very particular personal experience when I reviewed very positively his film Stealing Beauty in a newspaper, and in an Australian newspaper, and then like a week later, this incredibly expensive bottle of booze appeared at my front door of my home, and it was signed it was a message, it was a package from the local film distributor, who was a big commercial distributor of films, Columbia TriStar or something, and I rang the publicist and I said, you've sent me this incredible bottle of booze? And they said, no, Bernardo did. It was Bertolucci who had read the review and then gave the order to the distributor, send this guy this bottle of wine. So I felt very close to Bertolucci after that. And but yeah, no, look, what you're saying about Bertolucci is so true. That I mean, I would say I was angered by the obituaries on Bertolucci, because saddened and angered, because suddenly he was a guy who was dismissed. It was like he made The Conformist, a film that was influential on Paul Schrader, these kinds of comments, as if he was gone, he was just oblivious, a bit of oblivion in film history, and that we didn't need to look at any other Bertolucci film except The Conformist, which is total nonsense, of course, that's the only good film he made. And, the absolute richness of Bertolucci's career at almost every point, and I thought it was so sad that because of precisely the factors you were mentioning, that suddenly his name was, almost not to be spoken anymore. I find that bizarre, absolutely bizarre, and not at all, well, not respectful and not at all true to what he achieved. Okay, now on to Malick.
Right. Okay, this is going to be a Malick off. I'll state my interest immediately so that you know where I'm coming from. I'm writing a biography for Kentucky University Press, and it is a biography with a big B. It's not a director's study. It's not an analysis of the films. In fact, I've kind of finished it, and one self-criticism I have is I'm going to do another pass, and I'm sort of thinking to myself, I kind of need to go back and actually add a couple of paragraphs about each film so that it's not, that I'm not totally indifferent to the films in terms of what they actually mean and what they actually say, because I'm looking at it so much through the biographical lens. So that's my quixotic quest. And I did start writing about Malick when I was still at Liverpool. And I think one of the first things I wrote, very similar to what you said right at the very top of the conversation, I wrote a review of a film book, and it was a review of Hannah Patterson's The Films of Terrence Malick. And so that was kind of, and I think the headline of the review was, "Please make more films, Mr. Malick." A wish that I have since sometimes been very pleased that it's happened, and other times been more ambivalent about. But what's your history with Mr. T?
Well, firstly, let me ask you this important question. So, did you get access to Malick personally? Did he authorize your book?
No, right. No. No is a short answer. There's a longer answer, but I wouldn't be able to air that part of the conversation.
Okay, yeah, no, I understand exactly the kind of thing you mean, because in my book, now my book that I originally had a contract for with the BFI was essentially a critical study. But I wanted at least to get the basic outlines of his biography correct. Because remember, this is like the year 2000, and there wasn't a lot of work done by journalists or anyone on even the basic lines of his life, of his biographical trajectory. So I wanted to get at least some sketch of that down, and starting to research that, I very, very quickly found that there was a very, very tight protective circle around Malick, of his friends, of his collaborators. And sometimes this is my sense of it, he will allow them to speak, They obviously go to him and say, okay, Terry, should I speak to this person who's contacted me? And I think he then says yes or no to that. I certainly never got any direct contact with Malick himself. But then again, I wasn't really necessarily seeking it. I just wanted this sort of basic kind of outline. And I started sort of trying to contact people who I knew had worked with him, or had been to school with him, or had been around teaching him in his year at the American Film Institute. That was actually some of my most interesting things that I found there. And but for instance, I had the experience. I'm interested to know how you went with this one. I had the experience, and once again, this is the early 2000s, where I really wanted to see his student film, his AFI film, Lantern Mills, his short film. And I couldn't myself sort of afford the trip over to America, because I knew that the AFI had a videotape, a VHS of that film in their library, and I knew that they had lent that out sometimes to, on site, people could come and ask to watch it. And I had read a very, very interesting article by a German film student who had done this, who had made the pilgrimage to watch Lantern Mills and had written a long article about it, which I got my hands on, and I contacted the woman who wrote that article. It was very, very interesting. And then I sent one of my friends, who was a very well-known American professor of film. I sent my friend along, who lived, in LA, and he went to the library and he asked to see Lantern Mills, and then suddenly there was, I'm sorry, we have to check that before we allow you to do it. And then obviously, at this point, Malick was aware that there were these people wanting to see this film that he's not necessarily particularly proud of from his pre-first feature days, and he put a block on it, put a ban on it. So at that point, me trying to see Lantern Mills had actually triggered the mechanism whereby no one.
So it's your fault. God damn it, Adrian.
So did you see Lantern Mills? Did you get to see it through any digital means?
No, I haven't. And I know the article you're talking about, and I've used that. And it's the irony is that the film itself has become kind of probably much more important to my book, and I imagine to your study as well, by the very fact that it's absent. If it was, I just saw it and it was like, okay, it's Kubrick's Fear and Desire. You just watch it and you go, yeah, okay, I can see he's doing interesting things with the camera, but he hasn't worked out and the actors aren't up to scratch. And you could write about it in a paragraph and pretty much dismiss it. But the fact that it is this unobtainable, the fact that it's there, because he did another short film called Loose Change, which he made as his application film for the AFI. And now that just doesn't exist anywhere. Unless somebody digs it up, but there's no reports of anybody having seen that beyond the two or three people who were involved in making it, and perhaps somebody at the AFI who watched it. So that's just a sort of non-film. But Lantern Mills, the fact that it's there, and I also talked to Jack Fisk, who has seen it, and he said he had got a digital copy of it somehow and watched it, and that Malick was very sort of surprised that it's like, wait a minute, how did you get that? So it has become but I am assured that it is not an important film, and that it's technically embarrassing, and that one of the reasons, and this is all going to be more explicit in the forthcoming biography, is that one of the actors who was supposed to appear in the film, everybody's turning up to act in it for nothing and as a favor for a friend of a friend. So you've got Harry Dean Stanton and Warren Oates, which for a 1969, this is Warren Oates has just made The Wild Bunch. So he's turning up to this studio. It already shows that Malick has some pull, has some charm that other student filmmakers might benefit from. And there's the other guy is Clu Gallagher, I think he's called. He's the actor who turns up in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood to sell Sharon Tate a copy of Tessa the D'Urbervilles. He was supposed to be starring in it, and he pulled out at the last minute. And Malick had to say, "Okay, I'll play him. I'll play that role,"
Yeah.
which is
Yeah.
something that he then does in Badlands as well. And he, so I suspect that part of his reluctance for people to see the film is because he's in it.
Yeah.
I think if he wasn't in it, it would be out there. But he seems to have this aboriginal reluctance to have his image, out there and diffused. Even though nowadays, what with him filming song to song in Austin and all the rest of it, there are loads of images. He's on Instagram every other day with someone sort of spotting him and putting a pic up. But yeah, that's my Lantern Mills story. So I'm still hoping that at some point I might get a peek, but I'm also realizing that I don't want it to become a fetishistic thing where it's going to be the secret key that will unlock. I'm sure it isn't.
I don't think it's going to be that. No, it's more like such a curious thing with that cast that you're talking about, and Malick himself in it, and obviously this relation to a bit comedy and to sort of American genres that is more in those early days of Malick's career. His scripts for films that he didn't direct, it's more comes from that period, and that tendency in his work, which really disappears later. But I'll tell you one good story that you may not come across, because it was told to me by someone who's now dead. And it was one of Malick's teachers in the AFI time. This is the famous guy, Frank Daniel, who was a script teacher. Now, David Lynch, who was also, of course, in that year, that cohort with Schrader, with Tim Hunter, Malick, and so on. Lynch always tells the story of Frank Daniel taught him how to write a script, and it was by using 80 cards arranged in 8 rows, the famous 8-part technique of Frank Daniel. And he was like for a while, he was a very internationally famous kind of script guru. And in fact, I did, in the early 90s, I did a masterclass as a student with Frank Daniel, who was brought to Australia to workshop a whole lot of screenplays that had been written. And I was the script editor on one of these projects. So I got exposed to the wisdom of Frank Daniel for 1 week, the 80-card technique, the 8-part, all of this, the secrets of Frank Daniel were communicated to this small group of people. And, once you managed to get Frank, he was a very sort of phlegmatic guy. Once you managed to get him on his own, over a glass of wine, he would start to tell the stories of people that he knew and that he had taught. And he told me a great story about Terrence Malick, which is this. He said, according to Frank, on the day that Malick turned up to be interviewed to become a student of the American Film Institute, he had the script of Badlands in his hand. Like, he had already completely written the film.
No way.
And Frank was, he flipped through it, and he was kind of instantly amazed at that Malick had come so prepared, that, his vision was to prepare himself to make this film, Badlands. And Daniel said, so you've already written the script, what is it that you hope to learn at the American Film Institute? And Malick got very thoughtful. He kind of went into himself very introspectively for a moment, and then suddenly he came to life. He smashed his hand down on the table, and his answer was karate. He hoped to learn karate.
What the hell?
I mean, that's a different kind of image of Malick than often the one you get, the philosophical Heidegger reading, Terrence Malick. Oh. He's a guy who, makes a joke by, almost smashing the table in two.
Well, that's actually really, really consistent with what I've experienced and heard. Is the Malick who's incredibly funny and is very, and especially with his later films, you might sort of think, oh well, I don't see much humor in them, but I think that's partly to do with our response. I think we get this thing of like, oh, he wrote Heidegger, He translated Heidegger. I mean, yeah, that's true. There's no doubt about it. He's definitely incredibly clever. He's definitely cleverer than practically anybody else. You know what I mean? He's in that upper echelon of cleverness to the extent that it's almost like being abnormally tall. It's something which isn't just a benefit, it's also a problem for you. But alongside that, there is this incredible sense of fun. I'll tell you a story. I'll swap you a story. But
Okay.
and again, this is one that's nobody's heard before, so our listeners are getting a rare treat. This was told to me by a screenwriter who he basically, when he was out of filmmaking, or again, this is one of the big myths, is that he disappeared for 20 years. He didn't at all. He was in constant contact with all these people. He was lunching with, the head of TriStar Pictures, in the middle of all this. So anyway, in the middle of all this, he also starts mentoring screenwriters who he basically goes into a university program, and he says to them, okay, I want you to do a version of Jane Eyre. I want you to do this article I've got from a newspaper, and he'll get them all writing scripts, and the ones that he likes, he'll start collaborating with, and he'll start, putting them together and putting them together with a producer and a director and everything, and ushering them onto the big screen. This film comes to fruition. It's showing at the Berlin Film Festival, the Berlinale, and the screenwriter is in her hotel room and gets a phone call saying, "Okay, I'll meet you in the lobby of your hotel. I'm here," but from Terry Malick. So he's going to turn up and go to the premiere with her, but not the red carpet, but go to the screening. She goes down to the lobby, and she's very aware how reclusive he is, how much his privacy is important to him, how he doesn't want to be, doesn't want people to know he's here. They've all had the speech, "Don't tell anybody you're meeting," and she goes into the lobby, and he's standing in the middle of the lobby of the hotel, the Sheraton or wherever it is, wearing a red fez. And it's like nobody looks twice at a man in a red fez. This is my disguise.
That's great.
You said you were coming back towards Terrence Malick.
Yeah.
Now, so have you revived this book? The idea?
Well, to give you a bit of the fate of that book is that, when the BFI first contacted me for their series, World Cinema Directors, which a series that actually didn't go very far in BFI publishing, but I think it was maybe the first, or perhaps only 2 books came out, including one on Jane Campion. But anyway, they contacted me around 2000, and of course at that point there's only 3 feature films, and I thought, that's great. What a great idea. Just a book about 3 films, really in depth. And at that point, at that precise point, it wasn't at all clear that he would necessarily make more films. There were rumours and, many projects that we'd known that he had worked on to some extent, but may not ever happen. And so it was like, okay, I can cleanly write this book now about 3 films and get the book out. But then, of course, very quickly, the story started happening. No, he was going to direct another film, which turned out to be The New World. And so I said to my publisher, we better hang on for this film, and we'll make it a book about 4 films. We'll include New World. And then, of course, New World came, and then the rumours kept coming. No, there would be another. There were others coming, and then at a certain point, of course, with Tree of Life, suddenly this floodgate opens, and he never stops working. At that point, he never stops putting out the films. It's really kind of like one a year or one every 2 years. After that, particularly beginning with To the Wonder onwards, this stream of films that doesn't stop, and who knows when it will stop. So I kept putting off kind of, working more on the book, because certainly at the time of Tree of Life, and Tree of Life I think is one of his very greatest films, and it's like, I really need to rethink, some of my ideas about Malick here. He's going in a new direction. I have to see where this new direction is going, and the new direction, in a sense, has not stopped rolling out ever since, and then through Night of Cups, Song to Song. I like all of these films, but I knew that I would have to really think a lot more about them to really get a position on them and get an analysis and, you know, sort of work out some of my own mixed feelings about where he was going, where his style was evolving. And so in a way, I've been sort of still waiting, you know, to see where all that goes. And but just recently, I've sort of had a bit of a project that'll probably express itself as a video essay, an audio visual essay I make with my partner, Christina Alvarez Lopez. And we've been working on Knight of Cups, particularly, which is, you know, seems to me one of the best films of this more recent period of Malick. And, you know, we have some ideas about that we're going to sort of express, not necessarily ideas that are going to fit every other Malick film in this last, you know, 10, 15 years, but that film, at least, you know, that's my sort of way back into working on Malick. It's funny with Malick, approaching him as a critical writer, as a film analyst, because I really related to Michel Chion's book on Thin Red Line, where he starts the book by reprinting the proposal that he wrote for the BFI when they asked him for a 2-page summary. And so he wrote, you know, put all his effort into writing a 2-page summary, and then they said, great, write the book, you know, now write the book. And he reprints that, and then he says, I'm not sure I have anything more to say now that I've done my 2-page intensive summary, but I'll keep going, you know. So he keeps on and he writes the rest of the book. And I had a similar experience myself in that, you know, I put a lot of energy into a number of essays that I wrote on Malick during this whole period, including an essay called "Things to Look Into," and that phrase "things to look into" comes from Charles Starkweather. It comes from this incredible book written by a psychologist who interviewed Starkweather. Of course, we're relating Starkweather to Badlands, the real killer in American history, Starkweather and Fugate. And when I read this book by the psychologist, which took me an enormous amount of effort to get my hands on, it's called The Murderous Trail of Charles Starkweather. And there are parts of the script of Badlands. I mean, the voiceover of Badlands are by Starkweather. They're written by Starkweather, spoken by Starkweather in, you know, just before he was executed. And that was what a revelation that was, you know, that Malick had kind of, who takes his inspiration from wherever he can get it. But there are particular phrases of Starkweather's. I mean, Starkweather was in fact a strangely poetic character in his psychosis, you know. And he would talk about, you know, being far away from the world, and there are interesting things in the world, things to look into, you know, and these beautiful passages, some of which became Holly's voiceover in Badlands. It's something that no one had discovered until this moment that I read it in this book. Of course, that taught me that anything you can research about Malick's subjects, Guadalcanal, Fugate and Starkweather, you know, any topic, Pocahontas, any topic that he has actually treated, you quickly discover that anything you can read by way of research, he has read before you. Yeah. He knows all of that, which I think, you know, could have been, and could still be his greatest film if he gets to make it. When I researched the whole case of the case of Anna O, the famous case study, psychoanalytic case study of Anna O, I, for instance, found Jacques Lacan's commentary on it. When I read Jacques Lacan, I realised Malick has read this. He's read Lacan's comments on the case of Anna O, because they inform his script, the English speaker. Everything you can read about these things has informed his script in some often very subterranean way. Sometimes it's just like a phrase in a reportage book about Guadalcanal War, for instance. It sort of became an image in Thin Red Line. You know, he's obviously just taking in things from everywhere, all kinds of inspirations, and he's read it all. He's researched everything. You know, I'm sure this is something you've come across, John, that his research skills are absolutely formidable, better than any of our skills at this. And that, he has teams of people, and, I mean, incredible. Here's one thing I have to ask you, John. Have you managed to get your hands on the Criterion Laserdisc of Sancho the Bailiff, like before DVD, the
No.
Criterion Laserdisc?
No, why?
It has Malick's research materials for his stage presentation of Sancho the Bailiff.
Right.
Which was, as you know, is a project he worked on with a lot of difficulty in around the early to mid 90s. And he had, he had got his producers at the time, the famous controversial pair of producers that a lot has been written about. He got them to finance a whole lot of research into the Japanese history around Sancho the Bailiff, the historical period represented in Mizoguchi's film. He got new translations from Japanese sources made, and a lot of that material is on the Laserdisc, not on any subsequent DVD or of anything by Malick or anything by Mizoguchi. But that is, for instance, he let out some of his research materials, which are quite remarkable. So yeah, this was the kind of rabbit hole that I found myself going in, and I'm sure you've been in it too for years now. Writing your biography, is that the network of things that he knows, that he has explored, is really bottomless, and it can become an obsessive task of any researcher like you or I, trying to get into the mind of Malick, possibly an impossible thing finally, but we try our best.
Goes with what you said about the Badlands script, which is phenomenal. That is news to me, and will require another drafting of that chapter. But it's also the idea that everything he does, he's kind of been preparing for a lot longer than you think. So yes. That there's the scene in Badlands where they're in the sort of treehouse. In the original script, that was a wiki up. That was like a Native American thing. And Jack Fisk and his the local guy he'd hired, he said, "Oh, I tell you what would be good. Why don't I do a tree fort? We used to do these when we were kids. I could do it in a day." And Malick was like, "Are you sure you can do it in a day? Because, I don't want to go somewhere else, come back, and you need another day." And he's like, no, I could do it in a day. And it was only when he realized that the reason Malick had put the wiki up in was because he'd written a script called The Mother of Us All, which became the New World. So at the time of Badlands, he'd already written the New World, which he won't film until, 2008, 2009?
Yeah.
It's and even the film that he is currently on, I talked to an actor who was in it, and he's The Way of the Wind, the sort of the Jesus film, if you like.
Yeah.
That film, I was talking to this guy, Turkish actor, and he told me that he was talking to the production manager, and he said the production manager had been hired in 1999 to like a locations guy, and had already picked out the locations, and had already Malick himself had already picked out the locations for the shoot in 99, and would phone him every year and say, "Okay, I'm going to pay you a retainer. We're not going to do it this year, but I just want you, just make sure you keep everything, all the documentation and everything I need." And would just basically, because he just knew at some point I'm going to get to make this film. I just don't know when. And it's I mean, you often find people like Steven Spielberg will talk about something being a dream project or something they've wanted to do for years, and part of it is maybe PR bump to tell the story of the film, and part of it's probably possibly true, but with Malick, most of those films that have that sort of, he was planning this for 20 years, he was planning it for 20 years.
Yeah.
And again, that's why the gap between Days of Heaven and Thin Red Line just really isn't a gap, because he's writing scripts all this time, and some of them are getting made into films,
And in that period, the famous 20-year period, I've heard various stories which are sort of impossible to verify and pretty hard to even make public at a certain level, of his activity as a script doctor, that he worked on, for probably fabulous sums of money. He worked on just, revisions, or what John Sayles, who's also a script doctor, John Sayles calls running it through the typewriter. Like there is a script, and you just kind of colour it, you pepper it, you might move a few scenes around, you might write some extra dialogue. And somebody like John Sayles, he made a good living out of this, and meanwhile made all his own independent films, And in Australia, there was a very good screenwriters conference for a number of years, and a couple of script doctors, Alan Moyle from Canada and Sayles, and they talked a lot about the life of script doctor, which is fabulously well-paying and often completely anonymous work, because they're not credited, That's the whole deal.
That's part of the deal, yeah.
Yeah, and there's often a secrecy sort of clause on it, that they're not going to come out and say, I wrote the best dialogue in such and such a film, And I've heard various stories about Malick being a script doctor in one case on one very popular film. And I believe this in this case, as I think one can tell from the film, that he wrote some of the dialogue in it. And yeah, well, I won't say any more because I don't think I can.
And the name of the film?
I don't think I can say it, actually.
Okay. Well, in that case, let's wrap up quickly so that we can talk off the record. Listen,
but I wonder how much script doctoring he did in that period. I think there were definitely a few things that, we know he was commissioned to work on certain scripts, The Great Balls of Fire and stuff like that. But this script doctoring is a far more secretive kind of activity.
I totally agree. I think that's absolutely possible, to the point of highly probable. Listen, Adrian, I'd love to talk to you some more. And in fact, I'm launching another podcast in a few weeks about Italian cinema. So maybe you could come back and talk a little bit about a Bertolucci or a Leone, and we can...
fantastic. Yeah, right. Bellocchio is currently my favourite Italian film director. I absolutely love Bellocchio. I've sort of personally rediscovered the full span of his work, and this recent TV series, Esterno Notte, Exterior Night, absolutely brilliant work by Bellocchio.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant. Well, that would be great. But thank you so much for joining me. It's been really fun talking.
Yes, for me too, John.
So that was my conversation with Adrian Martin. We got so deep into it, I forgot to ask him for a recommended book, but don't worry, he'll be back, I'm absolutely sure. And as I said towards the end of the conversation there will be a new series coming out in the next few weeks called Cinema Italia, which will be an exploration of Italian films with some guests who have been on Writers on Film, and lots of Italian guests as well who are either directors or actors or in some way or writers or critics. So we get the idea would be to get a good perspective from different points of view, both inside Italy and outside of Italy, and to encourage people to watch some more Italian cinema, and perhaps with a new eye towards it. Okay. Thanks go to Ali Atkins for the music, Ali Howard for the art, and thank you, listener, for taking the time to be with me. I'll see you next week. Take care.